Long voyage back, page 19. By afternoon the cheap spake was still as a pond. Only the tiniest breaths of the wind occasionally hinted at movement, and Captain Oily and his son Chris worked steadily in the clear sunshine, enjoying the luxury of the calm water. They were harvesting their last oyster bed, using the long wooden shafts of their rake-like metal tongs with practice ease. Both Captain Oily, a small wizened old man, wrinkled and bald, and his 20-year-old son, a thick-set, husky youth, had huge forearms and biceps from the years of working the oyster beds. Their 20-foot fishing smack, Lucy May, with only a small deck house forward and a huge well aft for depositing the oysters, was old and paint-chipped and heeled over groggily as both men leaned over the same side. The two men had been working the bed since 1 o'clock that afternoon, starting a couple of hours before the 3 p.m. low tide. They planned to quit a couple of hours after the tide turned, and all that time their work proceeded in a casual, persistent rhythm, Oily talking away occasionally in what seemed like stream of consciousness monologues, Chris, quiet, steady, always puffing on a cigarette, now and then grunting a comment or answering a question. When Oily would lapse into silence or lean on his rake, Chris would continue raking, wielding the heavy tongs until he could feel he had a full load, then raising them to the surface and depositing their contents on the afterdeck. Most of the sorting would come later. The monologues and silences succeeded each other in a mood as relaxed as the becalmed bay. Chris would occasionally down a bottle of beer, his father a glass of water, sometimes coloured, with a dash of whisky. They never had to talk about their work. They knew their routine so thoroughly they could have oystered efficiently from dawn to dusk and not uttered a word. Smith Island, their home, lay to the east of them, Tangier Island to the south, and Point Lookout on the wide mouth of the Potomac to the west. As Captain Oily neared the end of his working day, he was feeling depressed by how tired he felt, and after less than 4 hours' work his belly ached. If he didn't stop and lean on his rake handle every 5 minutes or so, he got winded. This embarrassed him, and he knew that even if he tried to pretend to be so absorbed in his own monologues that he couldn't work, Chris would be able to tell he was shirking. Ever since Jill had ran off to Florida 2 years ago with Captain Smithers, his life had gone downhill. It was the first time since he was 14 he hadn't had a woman regular, and he felt his health was deteriorating fast as a result. The main reason he went oystering with Chris most every day was so he wouldn't get stuck alone in his house watching the TV. The man could go nuts watching those game shows and soaps. "I know, son," he found himself saying in an effort to cheer himself up. "Seems to me some of these oysters must have meningitis or something. Seems sort of stunted. We may have to sell them back to the circus as midgets." He deposited a load of oysters and muck onto the deck and was staring at it with exaggerated gloom. "Though I suppose midgets aren't in fashion anymore, even in the circus. People these days want things big. Big money, big boats, big tits." As he wiped the sweat from his bald forehead, he squinted southward at a couple of sailboats sitting like marble monuments in the bay. "That'll teach him," he thought vaguely, "the rich playboy good-for-nothings." "They even seem to want their wars bigger these days," he went on, turning his back to his work. "Setting up there in Moscow and Washington, calculating how they can build a real big elephant-like war that'll flatten the earth like a pancake so the gods can use it for a frisbee." As Oily lowered his tongs back into the water, Chris allowed himself an unaccustomed pause on his work. "There ain't going to be a war, is there, Pop?" he asked. "Well, now, you know I never predict what the rake'll bring up," he snapped back automatically, "but I got to say that imagination ain't created the stupid, terrible thing which man ain't fool enough to up and do." "They ain't fighting yet," Chris commented, pausing to light a fresh cigarette. "The way I figure it is the only reason they ain't made a frisbee of the earth before this is they've got a lot of smaller, terrible things they want to do first." Oily spat over the side of the boat onto the bay. "That's my great hope for mankind," he thought. "Man's got so many little sins he's got the hots for, he'll never get round to the big one." "You think so?" his son asked after a pause. "Of course I don't think so," Captain Oily snapped back irritably, again wiping his sweaty forehead with his thick-veined right arm. "You know I don't like to do any thinking." He chuckled. "Whenever I think, get a really deep thought, you know, I always have to take a crap." He paused and glared at his son, his eyes twinkling. "Standing at the helm alone in a blow, I got to watch my mind like a cat, be sure no deep thoughts come, 'cause taking a crap on a bouncy ship when you're all alone at the helm, and it's all you can do standing, much less squatting over a pail of the roller coaster while you're watching the compass and sail and handling the wheel, is a trick I've done once, but I don't hanker to do again." He paused and frowned in concentration. "The deep thought I had that time was hell. Time will tell. See? Deep thoughts just ain't worth the fuss and bother." As he looked with mock severity at his son who grinned back at him, Oily remembered that sail, and the old cheapskate beige skipjack that he'd owned and captained, dragging for oysters, in those days instead of fiddling around with his tiny rakes. But he couldn't afford a skipjack now, and he couldn't pull his weight as crew. So he settled for Lucy May. It kept him alive, but barely. "Shit," he thought, as he had to pause again. I wish to hell I'd just get it over with and croak. Not much sense in living if you can't work and can't fuck. Nowadays, when he'd go into restaurants or bars and flirt with the cute little top-butted waitresses, they either be shocked at him or treat him like a harmless child. When a man couldn't turn on a woman, it was time to cash in his chips. Women used to always be pestering him, first for his cock and then for his deep thoughts. He wished now one was pestering him. Women are always asking what I'm thinking, he spoke aloud, watching 3 seagulls fly noisily around the stern of Lucy May and then plop expectantly into the bay. But after 4 wives, I finally figured out how to handle them. I always say I'm thinking about the wind and weather and repairing my dinghy and how much I love her ass. Well, every woman I've known will frown and frown and frown until I get to my deep thoughts about her ass. And then everything's jolly. A man who limits his deep thoughts to a woman's ass is a sober man, trustworthy and true, and likely to stay out of trouble. Chris was smiling as he worked, but Oiley's face was as stern as a Baptist preacher. He paused and took a long drink of water from the glass on the deckhouse shelf. He damn well wished he had a lady these days whose ass he could praise, even if her ass was flatter than an ironing board. "Getting late, Pop," Chris said, making him suddenly aware he was leaning on his rake again. "Late?" Oiley snapped back. "We've just begun." But he began to clean out his rake with a sense of relief. "I've been talking so much today I'm pooped," he added. "I do love talking," he thought as he emptied his last load onto the boat. "Especially my own talking. As Chris's mother once said, I think it was his mother, could have been someone else's. Oiley, I never knew a man who listened to himself as good as you do." He smiled. "Carl Markham said this morning the radio makes it sound like war," Chris said suddenly, as if it had been on his mind much of the day. Oiley looked at him in surprise. "Son, you got to stop listening to people who babble," he said firmly. "Of course there's going to be war. They ain't keeping all those jets dancing across the sky just for skywriting forever, you know. A government is a business, and sooner or later the government is going to want its money's worth." His son looked at him with youthful seriousness. "What are you going to do, Pop, when it happens?" he asked. Captain Oiley tossed his empty tongs onto the forward cabin with a sense of relief and then stared out across the water. "I'm going to run, son," he said with a sigh. "That's why I'm going to take up jogging. I would have taken it years ago, but I ain't learned how to do it on the water yet. Christ knows a cheapskate's got enough mud in it to support a man 3 times my weight, but somehow I just can't get the hang of it." He wouldn't run, though. He would almost welcome if it came, especially if the war would just take him and let Chris live to enjoy asses for another 40 years as he had done. He always hated seeing old geezers sitting around in front of the general store, useless and unneeded, and though he was probably now a geezer, he wasn't going to be a sitter. No, he wouldn't run, unless he figured there was a live lady up the road a ways, or a solid bit of honest work he could do. Then maybe he'd stick around, take up jogging. Lethargically, Jean gathered up and packed her clothes and sleeping bags for the cruise aboard Vagabond. She had no heart for the trip, no heart really for anything these days. She was packing only for herself, Lisa and Skip, since Bob had telephoned at 3 that afternoon to tell her that the Defence Department had asked everyone over the level of G2 to work over the weekend. He couldn't sail with them in the cheapspake. He'd be coming home early only to eat and get a change of clothes. As she moved around Skippy's bedroom and then her own, Jean was close to tears. It was anger and frustration at the insane way the Americans and the Russians were stumbling towards war. Frustration at her own incapacity to do anything. Anger at Bob's failure even to see what was happening. Anger that she had married him. Normally lithe, cat-like and intense, she moved dully, her long dark hair hanging limply down her back instead of bouncing as it usually did when she moved. She felt she had married the wrong man and was living only half a life. As she carefully closed the suitcase, she imagined Bob's superior, ironic smile at such a cliché. He would assure her that of course she had married the wrong man. Everybody did. But that was no reason to be miserable. Lisa came into her bedroom to ask if she could go visit her girlfriend Nancy before dinner, and Jean had to focus her eyes for a moment to see her daughter clearly. Framed in the doorway, Lisa held her tall, budding 15-year-old body with that strange stiff dignity she had adopted over the last 2 years, to show she was no longer a child. It irritated Jean, reminding her of the worst of the Forrester family stuffiness. Compared to Lisa, round, energetic, happy-faced Skippy seemed appropriately at 5, spontaneous and free. "Have you finished your packing?" she asked. "I did it last night," Lisa replied. "But don't forget to pack the lotions and towels you promised." I will. But look, honey, I need your help here. We'll be eating as soon as your father gets home. I'd like you to go downstairs and start heating up the leftover stew. I'll be down soon." "Oh, Mother," Lisa replied, "can't you do that?" "Go," said Jean. And she went, with a promise that never ceased to amaze Jean. Was that Bob's doing? In another moment she was alone again with her 2 suitcases and her sleeping bags. Living with Bob wasn't working anymore, and she knew why. The war thing had gotten too big and it was too important to both of them. The whole world was divided into two groups, those desperately trying to avoid a war and those desperately trying to make sure that their side won it. She and Bob were on opposite sides, and the tension between them was becoming too strong. The tension often tempted her just to give up. The cause she was working for seemed so hopeless. For close to 3 years she'd been active in a Washington-based group called SMN, Stop the Madness, now an eclectic collection of feminists, political radicals, pacifists, scientists, doctors, and even a few former high-ranking military officers, all of whom agreed on only one issue: the necessity of taking drastic action to reverse the momentum towards nuclear war. She'd begun as a volunteer, in effect an unpaid secretary, but a year ago had been put on part-time staff as a fundraiser, an occasional speechwriter and editor for one of the retired admirals. But a promotion had, over the last 6 months, only made her increasingly depressed. The admiral spoke to the same audiences. The fundraising events raised the same piddling amounts of money. Their yearly total budget would barely finance the cost of a single jet fighter. The letters got published in the Washington Post and the New York Times and sank out of sight like pebbles in the sea. The marches got marched and forgotten. Great masses of Americans vaguely worried about war remained quite precisely and quite seriously worried about how they were going to meet their mortgage payments or feed their children. The prolonged worldwide economic crisis, which was so critically exacerbating global political tensions, also made the tasks of reducing nuclear armaments and creating a United Nations superforce very low priorities on most people's agendas. The United States and the Soviet Union argued and manoeuvred for power. She and Bob argued and manoeuvred for what she didn't know, and all four sides became increasingly alienated from one another. Bob came home at 6, gave a big hug to Skippy, a dignified kiss to Lisa, several words and caresses to their terrier Banjo, and a cheerful "Hi, honey" to her. He went straight upstairs to change his clothes and pack an overnight bag. 10 minutes later they had all had dinner together. Jean's scruffy jeans, open-neck cotton blouse, and her dark hair falling wildly about her face and shoulders contrasted sharply with her husband's neat three-piece suit, neatly combed dark hair and chiselled good looks. But she sensed that their moods were aligned. They were both subdued and anxious, hoping to control their conflict. As he sat at opposite ends of the table with Lisa on Jean's left and Skip propped up on 2 pillows on her right, Lisa looked at Jean that evening with her erect posture and precise adult-sounding speech patterns, like a young governess in some Victorian melodrama. Her husband was the villain, and she? She certainly no longer felt like a heroine, now that her sporadic idealistic efforts to promote disarmament and peace had proved to be so clearly ineffective. She felt as weak and foolish as Bob had always accused her of being. Yet as she watched him eating his dinner so meticulously and talking with such total seriousness with Lisa about the clothing she planned to take with her, she could feel herself getting angry. It was her anxiety being transmuted into anger. Anger at those who were causing her to be afraid, the Russians and the Pentagon and people like Bob, who could so coolly calculate and contemplate the probabilities of various world catastrophes. "And what are you going to do today, Daddy?" Jean heard Lisa say, and saw Bob start in surprise that the forbidden subject had been broached. "Just playing with Mars," he replied with a soft smile. He poured himself more wine and awkwardly signalled with the bottle to ask her if she wanted more. She shook her head. "Is that all you ever do?" Lisa asked a little impatiently. "I suppose so," he replied, "but the situation these days has been changing so fast we have to feed our monster fresh food 5 times a day instead of once or twice a week." She noticed his eyes flash as he said this. "It sounds boring," said Lisa. "Calculating the probability of various war scenarios is many things, some of which your mother has strong feelings about," Bob replied. "But one thing it is never is boring." "You're enjoying this crisis, aren't you?" Jean said quietly as she moved forward to wipe up some spilled gravy from Skip's shirt. "I suppose for you it's like playing in the Super Bowl." Bob put down his fork and took a sip of wine. "People are rather interested in our calculations these days," he said, smiling nervously. "I'm human enough to enjoy using my capabilities to the fullest and knowing I'm needed." "That's fine," Jean said slowly, but are you also human enough to be scared?" He looked startled, then laughed. "As a matter of fact, yes," he replied. "The world is in a critically dangerous situation. I'm rather proud that our department, probably more than any other, is responsible for determining just how dangerous." "Why proud?" she asked quietly. Whenever they began to argue, their voices would get softer and softer, a trait that she realized she had adopted from him. Their civility went with the French provincial furniture, which had once told him that if he ever got really mad at her, his voice would get so low no one could hear it. "Because we're the ones who can warn the President which of his policy decisions are most dangerous," Bob answered. "Without us, he might do something that would provoke the Soviets into attacking us." Jean took a last spoonful of stew and wiped her mouth. "And does the computer tell you what happens if they do attack?" she asked. No, Jupiter does, Bob replied, absently pushing Skip's hand away from the plate of chocolate chocolate chip cookies. Jupiter calculates who will probably win once a war starts. We on Mars just calculate the chance of a war starting. And what are the chances? She asked with a coolness she did not feel. Pretty high, aren't they? He looked at her somberly and shook his head. You know better than that, he replied. Obviously no one really knows, not even Mars, and if it did, I wouldn't tell you. Thanks, she said. But I thought I knew I'd bundle you and the kids off to the South Pacific. I certainly wouldn't be chatting with you 10 miles from the White House with a glass of wine in my hand. Instead, you're sending me off to the cheapskate, she countered, feeling even as she spoke that it was a childish remark. I do want you to go, Jean, he said with his usual seriousness. Why? She answered, frowning. You know I'm not fond of being on the water. It's no safer there than any place else. Because I want you and the children to get away and have a good time, he replied. Lisa's always had a crush on Jimmy, he went on, smiling at his daughter. And Neil Loken's a hunk, if you like the type. Give me back my cookie, Skippy said abruptly. What's the type? Jean asked, remembering the previous summer Bob had found the captain of Fisherson remote. You've had enough, announced Lisa. Horatio Hornblower, Bob replied, the quiet He-Man always standing tall on the poop deck, squinting into salt spray, letting everyone know he's in command. I have not, Skippy whispered in his squeaky voice. I've had 6, same as you. Well, we've had enough. You make him sound like a pain in the neck, said Jean. I have not, Skippy said firmly. Let go, Lisa hissed as Skippy's little body sprawled across the tablecloth, lunging for a plate of cookies. Ouch, you shit, said Skippy. Skip, Bob Forrester exclaimed. Don't swear like that and sit down. She pinched me. Lisa, leave Skip's punishment to us, Jean said wearily. He was stealing a cookie, Lisa insisted with dignity. I was not, Skippy exclaimed. Bob erupted finally from his chair and pulled his son firmly back into his seat, twice striking him sharply on the hand, Jean wincing with each slap. As the boy pouted and fought back tears, Bob resumed his seat and looked self-consciously back at Lisa and Jean. Yes, now, where were we, he said. At sea, said Jean ironically. Oh yes, Neil, Bob went on, adjusting his cloth napkin on his lap, his narrow eyes scowling. He's too quiet to be a pain in the neck. His eyes crinkled into a smile. You have to be aware of his loud quietness in order to be annoyed. Some people like him. Women, I imagine, would find him attractive. Not if he never leaves the poop deck, Jean commented. Bob glanced at his watch and stood up, smiling awkwardly. Oh, Frank tells me he's perfectly willing to come down to, shall we say, ride frailer vessels? Jean glanced over at Lisa. Daddy means he can be a make-out artist, she explained to her mother. Jean laughed for the first time that day. Thank you, sweetheart, she said. Mummy, said Skippy. Yes, dear. If there's going to be a war, I think we should eat all the cookies now. And this time they all laughed. But when Bob prepared to turn to Washington 20 minutes later, she didn't laugh. He called her over to him and took her in his arms and said simply, I love you. For years he hadn't said the words. Their separations were marked by such parting comments as, where did you leave the keys to the rabbit? Or I hope you left the refrigerator well stocked. But that evening, just when she felt herself most alienated from him in their life together, he said, I love you. She looked across at him, her large dark eyes widening with both surprise and attention. All right, was all she could say. Go down to Point Lookout tonight, he went on. Get on the boat. Forget the mess the world's in. Again at first she could only stare at him. You come too, she said impulsively, feeling a sudden fear. I've got my job, he said. Leave it, she countered desperately. He smiled softly, a tinge of sadness in it. I like my job, he replied. She felt the wall fall between them again as he started to turn, though. She grasped his arm and held it. You're a good man, she said. Really? He said, with the same half-sad smile. They looked at each other, and for the first time she saw that he was afraid too. Then she saw the emotion click off and the computer come back on. He frowned. Did you remember to get some frozen dinners in the freezer, he asked. Yes, she answered. Good, he said, pecked her cheek and was gone. With Vagabond becalmed, Neil finally had Jim put the 7-horsepower outboard onto the inflatable dinghy to tow the trimaran into the docks of Tangier Island. Earlier, even after the wind had fallen to mere puffs in the late afternoon, they'd been able to ride the incoming tide towards Crisfield. But as the sun set and the tide was about to turn against them, they were still almost 15 miles short of their goal. Finding himself only a mile off the little village of Tangier, and needing to let Frank know what had happened to them, Neil had Vagabond towed in the dinghy.